There's a dangerous kind of blindness that infects a man when he convinces himself he is the savior of his marriage. For 3 years, Richard Sterling looked at his wife, Maya, and saw a charity case. A quiet woman from a supposedly modest background who should have been endlessly grateful for the suburban life he provided. He paraded his 6-figure corporate salary like a crown, unaware that the woman silently serving hors d'oeuvres to his condescending colleagues stood to inherit a multi-billion-dollar global empire. When the truth finally shattered his meticulously crafted reality, it didn't arrive with a whisper. It arrived in a fleet of bulletproof Maybachs, right in the middle of the most important dinner of his life. The sprawling, heavily mortgaged 4-bedroom house in Oak Brook, Illinois, was perfectly immaculate, just the way Richard liked it. He stood in the center of the kitchen, aggressively adjusting the cuffs of his Brooks Brothers shirt, his pale blue eyes scanning the marble countertops for a single imperfection. Tonight was not just a dinner, it was an audition. David Brentwood, the formidable CEO of Ardent Solutions, was coming over. For Richard, this evening was the golden key to the vice president of regional sales position, a role that carried a $250,000 base salary, stock options, and the unassailable validation Richard desperately craved. "Maya!" Richard's voice cut through the soft jazz playing from the ceiling speakers. "Did you decant the Cabernet? I told you specifically the Stag's Leap needs at least an hour to breathe. David is a wine snob." Maya emerged from the dining room, smoothing the skirt of her elegant, understated emerald dress. Her dark skin glowed under the recessed lighting, her posture naturally straight, a lingering habit from years of rigorous boarding school etiquette that Richard had always mistaken for stiffness. "It's been decanting for an hour and 15 minutes, Richard," Maya said evenly, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to his frantic energy. "The tenderloin is resting. The sides are in the warming drawer." Richard let out a sharp, exasperated sigh, pacing toward the wine station. "I just want this perfect. You know how important this is to me. If I get this VP role, we can finally stop living paycheck to paycheck on my salary alone. I might even be able to increase your allowance so you can upgrade your little design studio setup." Maya's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Allowance. The word always tasted like ash in her mouth. When they had met 3 years ago in Chicago, Maya was deliberately living a minimalist life. She had fled the suffocating, high-stakes world of her family in Atlanta. The Hayes dynasty, a legendary black family whose tentacles reached deep into global logistics, commercial real estate, and private equity. She had wanted to know who she was without her father's billions shielding her from reality. She wanted to be a freelance graphic designer, rent a modest apartment in Wicker Park, and find someone who loved her for her, not her trust fund. Then she met Richard. He was charming, ambitious, and seemingly grounded. He had assumed from her tiny apartment and budget-conscious habits that she came from nothing. He loved playing the provider. But over the years, that provider instinct had mutated into a suffocating, condescending paternalism. He constantly reminded her of his financial superiority, belittled her freelance work, and treated her like a rescued stray. "My design work is doing fine, Richard," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I actually picked up a new corporate branding client today." Richard let out a short, dismissive laugh. "That's cute, honey. But a couple of $100 for a logo isn't going to pay the mortgage on this place, is it? Just focus on being the charming hostess tonight. Let me do the heavy lifting with David and Cynthia. Just smile, serve the food, and agree with whatever David says." Maya looked at her husband, really looked at him, the man she had once thought of as driven. Now just seemed fragile, his entire ego propped up by the artificial hierarchy of his corporate job. She remembered the fierce, booming voice of her father, Arthur Hayes, echoing in the study of their colossal Buckhead estate when she first told him about Richard. "He doesn't look at you as an equal, Maya," her father had warned, swirling a glass of neat scotch. "He looks at you as an accessory to his own ego. You're playing dress-up as a middle-class housewife. But what happens when the wolf figures out the sheep he's trying to herd actually owns the pasture?" Maya had stubbornly cut ties with her family's wealth, freezing her trust accounts to prove her father wrong. She hadn't spoken to Arthur in over a year. She wanted her marriage to work, but standing in this kitchen, listening to Richard tell her to just smile and serve, something inside her quietly fractured. The chime of the front doorbell echoed through the house, saving Richard from noticing the sudden, icy shift in his wife's eyes. "They're here," Richard hissed, his face instantly transforming into a mask of eager, obsequious joy. "Showtime. Don't mess this up, Maya." He practically sprinted to the foyer. Maya stood alone in the kitchen for a moment longer. She picked up her phone, which had been buzzing incessantly on silent for the past 30 minutes. She had 20 missed calls from her brother, Winston, and one text message from a private number. "We need to talk. I'm in Chicago." She flipped the phone over, face down on the marble, and walked out to greet her husband's boss. The first hour of the dinner party was an exercise in pure, excruciating theatre. David Brentwood was a thick-set, balding man who spoke in corporate buzzwords and carried the quiet arrogance of a man who knew he controlled the livelihoods of everyone at his table. His wife, Cynthia, was a pale, heavily Botoxed woman dripping in Cartier, who seemed to view Maya as an exotic curiosity rather than a peer. "This house is quite lovely, Richard," Cynthia drawled, delicately picking at her salad. "Oak Brook is such a nice area. It must be quite a stretch for a regional manager, though." "Well, Cynthia, it takes discipline." Richard beamed, leaning forward and casually resting his hand over Maya's, a performative gesture of possession. "I believe in providing a solid foundation. It's a lot of responsibility, taking on all the financial burdens, but it allows Maya the freedom to pursue her little art projects from home." Maya slowly withdrew her hand from beneath his. "Graphic design," she corrected politely. "I specialize in brand identity." David chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that sounded more patronizing than amused. "Good for you, Maya. Keep busy. Keeps you out of Richard's hair while he's climbing the ladder. Speaking of which, Richard, the VP role requires absolute dedication. No distractions. We're currently trying to secure a massive supply chain contract with a major logistics firm out of Atlanta. If we don't land it, Ardent Solutions is going to have a very rough third quarter. I need a VP who will live and breathe this company." "You have my word, David," Richard said, his eyes practically gleaming with desperation. "I am 100% focused. Maya understands that my career comes first. Everything else is secondary." Maya took a slow, deliberate sip of her water. A logistics firm out of Atlanta. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Ardent Solutions was a mid-level tech infrastructure company. They had been trying to bid for a contract with Hayes Global Logistics for 18 months. Maya knew this because she had secretly reviewed the proposal drafts when Richard brought them home, privately thinking Ardent's infrastructure was far too weak for her father's empire. "Atlanta?" Maya asked innocently, setting a glass down. "Which firm?" Richard shot her a glaring, sharp look, a silent command to shut up and stay out of the men's talk. David, however, waved his hand. "Hayes Global. You wouldn't know them, sweetheart. They're a private, multi-billion-dollar behemoth. Old money, ruthless operators. The CEO, Arthur Hayes, is a ghost. Getting an audience with him is like trying to get an audience with the Pope. We're hoping to impress one of his junior acquisitions directors next month. Maya bit the inside of her cheek to stop herself from laughing. Her father was many things. Domineering, stubborn, impossibly demanding. But he was not a ghost to her. I see, Maya said softly. Well, I wish you luck with Mr. Hayes. Luck won't cut it, but thanks, Richard muttered, eager to steer the conversation back to his own merits. As I was saying about the regional sales forecasts. Suddenly, the warm, amber ambiance of the dining room was abruptly disrupted. Brilliant, blinding white lights swept across the large bay windows facing the front yard, illuminating the dining room like a stadium. The low, heavy rumble of massive engines vibrated through the floorboards of the house. It wasn't just one car, it sounded like a convoy. Richard frowned, pausing mid-sentence. What on earth? Did a delivery truck take a wrong turn into our driveway? David craned his neck to look out the window. Richard, those aren't delivery trucks. Outside, idling on Richard's meticulously manicured driveway, were 3 identical, jet-black Cadillac Escalades, their tinted windows impenetrable. Behind them, a sleek Mercedes Maybach pulled up, parking illegally across the curb. The sheer weight and presence of the vehicles screamed authority and immense, untouchable wealth. "What is going on?" Cynthia gasped, clutching her linen napkin. Richard stood up, his face flushed with a mixture of confusion and profound irritation. "I don't know. Probably some confused driver looking for the country club. I'll go handle it. Excuse me." "Richard," Maya said. Her voice was entirely different now. The soft, accommodating tone she had used for 3 years was gone. It was replaced by something sharp, cold, and commanding. "Sit down." Richard froze, turning to stare at his wife, as if she had suddenly spoken in tongues. "What did you say to me?" Before Maya could answer, the heavy oak front door of the house didn't just open. It was forcefully swung inward. Richard hadn't locked it yet. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed in the foyer. 2 men in immaculate, tailored dark suits and subtle earpieces stepped into the house, their eyes scanning the perimeter with terrifying, professional efficiency. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Richard yelled, his false bravado kicking in. He marched toward the hallway. "You can't just walk into my house. I'm calling the police." "Stand down, sir," one of the men said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a lethal, absolute authority that made Richard stop dead in his tracks. From the shadows of the foyer, a 3rd figure emerged. He was a tall, powerfully built black man in his late 60s. He wore a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that likely cost more than Richard's car. He carried a silver-tipped walking cane, though he clearly didn't need it for balance. It was an accessory of power. His silver hair was perfectly cropped, and his eyes, dark, calculating, and utterly unyielding, locked onto the dining room. Behind him stood a younger man in his early 30s, a near mirror image of the older man, exuding the same aggressive, aristocratic confidence. Winston. Maya remained seated at the head of the table. She didn't look surprised. She looked exhausted. David Brentwood let out a strangled, breathless sound. The blood completely drained from the CEO's face. He scrambled out of his chair so fast it tipped over, crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. "Mr. Hayes?" David stammered, his voice trembling, all his corporate bravado evaporating into thin air. "Arthur Hayes?" Richard spun around, looking wildly from his terrified boss to the imposing stranger standing in his hallway. "David, what's going on? You know this guy?" Arthur Hayes ignored Richard entirely. He didn't even register Richard's existence. The billionaire patriarch stepped fully into the light of the dining room, his gaze bypassing the CEO, bypassing the expensive decor, and landing squarely on the woman at the end of the table. "Hello, Maya," Arthur said, his deep, resonant voice echoing in the sudden, deafening silence of the house. Maya finally stood up. She smoothed her dress, lifted her chin, and met the billionaire's gaze with equal intensity. "Hello, Father," she replied. Richard Sterling felt the floor drop out from underneath him. The silence in the dining room was absolute, thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic ticking of the Restoration Hardware clock on the wall, a clock Richard had proudly purchased with his first Christmas bonus. It suddenly felt incredibly cheap. Richard stared at his wife. Maya had not moved toward the imposing billionaire in their foyer, nor had she cowered. She simply stood at the end of the mahogany table, her posture radiating a quiet, terrifying authority that Richard had never seen in their 3 years of marriage. "Father," Maya repeated, her voice devoid of the warmth Richard usually demanded from her. "You're tracking mud onto the Persian rug, the one Richard insisted we finance." Arthur Hayes glanced down at the intricate wool rug beneath his bespoke Italian Oxfords, then looked back up at his daughter, a faint, humorless smirk playing on his lips. "Send me the bill, Maya. Though given the circumstances, I doubt you'll be worrying about financing anything ever again." David Brentwood was still scrambling to his feet, his face an alarming shade of crimson. He leaned heavily against the dining table, knocking over a crystal wine glass. The expensive Cabernet spilled across the linen tablecloth like a blood stain, but neither David nor his wife, Cynthia, seemed to notice. Cynthia was pressed back into her chair, her eyes darting frantically between Maya and the phalanx of men in the hallway. "Mr. Hayes," David wheezed, practically tripping over his own feet as he tried to round the table. "David Brentwood, Ardent Solutions. We've submitted multiple proposals to your acquisitions team. It is a profound honor to have you in my regional manager's home." Arthur didn't even turn his head. He flicked a single finger, and one of the towering security details smoothly stepped into David's path, placing a flat, immovable palm against the CEO's chest. David stopped instantly, swallowing hard. "Winston," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly command. The younger man, Maya's brother, stepped out from behind their father. Winston Hayes possessed the kind of effortless, predatory grace that only came from a lifetime of immense wealth and power. He was dressed in a navy Tom Ford suit, a Patek Philippe watch gleaming discreetly at his wrist. "Hello, little sister," Winston said, stepping past the security guards and into the dining room. He casually surveyed the suburban home, his eyes lingering on the framed generic artwork and the modest chandelier. He didn't sneer, but the sheer pity in his gaze was worse. "Playing house in the suburbs. It's been 3 years, Maya. The Bohemian experiment has officially run its course." Richard felt a hot, blinding surge of adrenaline and confusion. He stepped squarely between Winston and Maya, puffing out his chest. "Excuse me. I don't care who you people think you are, or if David here knows you. This is my house. You are trespassing, and you do not speak to my wife that way." Winston stopped. He looked at Richard for the first time. It wasn't a look of anger. It was the look a scientist gives a particularly uninteresting insect under a microscope. "Your house," Winston echoed, amused. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a sleek, black leather folio, tossing it onto the dining table. It landed with a heavy thud next to the spilled wine. "Richard Sterling, mid-level management, credit score of 680, currently carrying $45,000 in credit card debt, largely to maintain the illusion of upper-middle-class prosperity. You bought this house with a 5% down payment and an adjustable-rate mortgage. Richard's face drained of color. "How do you—" "I know everything about you, Richard," Winston interrupted smoothly. "I knew about you the day Maya met you in that coffee shop in Wicker Park. We let this little charade continue because our father believed Maya needed to learn a lesson about the real world. A lesson about the kind of men who need to feel big by making their wives feel small." "Winston, enough!" Maya snapped. Her voice cracked like a whip, and to Richard's absolute shock, the arrogant young billionaire actually fell silent, dipping his head in a gesture of deferential respect. Maya stepped around Richard. She didn't look at him. She looked directly at her father. "You didn't fly on the Gulf Stream from Atlanta to Chicago just to critique my husband's mortgage, father," Maya said, crossing her arms. "The board meeting is tomorrow. Why are you here?" Arthur leaned heavily on his silver-tipped cane. "Because your grandfather's trust vested at midnight, Maya. The stipulations were clear. Upon your 30th birthday, your frozen assets unlock, and your voting shares in Hayes Global activate. You now officially hold 35% of the company. I hold 40. Winston holds 15. The board holds the rest." Richard's knees suddenly felt like they were made of water. 35%. He couldn't grasp the math, but he knew Hayes Global was valued in the tens of billions. The numbers short-circuited his brain. He looked at his wife, the woman he had just berated for not decanting the wine correctly, the woman he gave a strict $400 a month allowance, and saw a stranger. "And?" Maya pressed, unmoved by the staggering financial revelation. "And," Arthur continued, his eyes hardening, "Goldman Sachs is pushing for the European merger with the Sterling Cooper Logistics Network. The board is split. Winston is with me. We need your proxy vote tomorrow morning to authorize the $12 billion acquisition. The lawyers from Covington and Burling are waiting at the Four Seasons downtown. I am not leaving Chicago without your signature." Wait a minute," Richard stammered, his voice cracking, high and thin. He grabbed Maya's arm. It was a desperate, possessing grip. "Maya? What is he talking about? Billions? You told me your family ran a small trucking business in Georgia." Maya looked down at Richard's hand on her arm. Then she looked up into his pale, panicked eyes. "I told you my family was in logistics, Richard," she said softly, but the warmth was completely gone. "You assumed the rest because it fit the narrative you wanted. You wanted a wife you could save, a wife you could control. Remove your hand from her," Arthur said. The billionaire didn't shout, but the sheer, lethal drop in the room's temperature made Richard instantly recoil, dropping Maya's arm as if it had caught fire. David Brentwood was practically hyperventilating. The CEO of Ardent Solutions, a man who had terrorized Richard for 3 years with performance reviews and arbitrary sales targets, was currently wiping sweat from his forehead with a wine-stained napkin. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had completely inverted, throwing everyone into a disorienting freefall. "Maya!" David rasped, his eyes wide and pleading. He completely ignored Richard now. Richard was a ghost, a non-entity. "Mrs. Sterling, I had no idea. When Richard spoke of you, he made it sound as though you were, well, a domestic engineer. He made it sound like I was his dependent, David," Maya corrected smoothly. She turned her attention to her husband's boss, and Richard felt a sickening lurch in his stomach as he watched his wife adopt the exact same corporate predatory gaze as her father. "He made it sound like my freelance branding agency, which, by the way, handles the discreet rebranding for 3 Fortune 500 companies under NDAs, was a cute little hobby." "Maya, please," Richard begged, stepping forward, his hands raised defensively. We can talk about this after they leave. We are a team." "Are we?" Maya asked, tilting her head. "Because 30 minutes ago, you told me to just smile, serve the food, and agree with whatever David says. You told me my income couldn't pay the mortgage." She paused, letting the silence hang. "You're right, Richard. It couldn't. But my quarterly dividend check could buy this entire neighborhood and bulldoze it for a parking lot." Cynthia Brentwood let out a tiny, high-pitched gasp, pressing her manicured hands over her mouth. David took a desperate step forward, his corporate survival instincts kicking in. "Maya, Ms. Hayes, regarding the Ardent Solutions proposal for your Midwest supply chain." "Ah, yes, the proposal," Maya said, her eyes flashing with a cold brilliance. "I read it, David. Richard left it on the kitchen island last week. He told me not to touch it, of course, because the big words might confuse me." Richard closed his eyes, a wave of profound nausea washing over him. He had said exactly that. He had thought it was a playful joke. Now the memory felt like a death sentence. Maya continued, her voice clinical and precise. "Your infrastructure is entirely unscalable. Your server latency in the Chicago to Detroit corridor is unacceptable for our cold chain pharmaceutical storage needs. Your cybersecurity protocols are 3 years out of date, and your projected cost savings were mathematically fraudulent. I already emailed my father's acquisitions team from my private server yesterday, instructing them to reject your bid permanently." David looked as though he had been physically struck. He staggered back, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He slowly turned to Richard, his expression morphing from terror into absolute, unadulterated rage. "You!" David hissed, pointing a trembling finger at Richard. "You arrogant, incompetent fool! You had the heiress to the Hayes empire living in your house, and you treated her like a maid. You've cost this company a $200 million contract." "David, wait, I didn't know," Richard pleaded, panic fully taking over. His perfect life, his VP promotion, his entire identity was disintegrating before his eyes. "You can't blame me for this. She lied to me." "I never lied," Maya said quietly. "I just let you believe what made you feel powerful. And I watched how you treated me when you thought I had nothing." Arthur Hayes struck his cane against the hardwood floor. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, demanding absolute silence. "The social hour is over," Arthur declared. "Winston, get her coat. Maya, the car is waiting. We have a brief to review before the morning." "Wait, you can't just leave," Richard yelled, panic turning into a frantic, pathetic aggression. He moved toward Maya again, but this time the 2 security guards moved in unison. Before Richard could even blink, a massive hand clamped onto his shoulder, spinning him around and forcefully shoving him backward. Richard tripped over the leg of a dining chair and crashed hard onto the floor, knocking over a side table. "Richard!" Maya yelled, taking half a step forward, her instinct to help him warring with the cold reality of the moment. "Leave him," Winston said, stepping between Maya and her husband. He draped a stunning, heavy cashmere coat over his sister's shoulders, a coat Richard had never seen before. "He's right where he belongs, on the floor, looking up." Maya looked down at Richard. He was scrambling to sit up, his perfectly pressed Brooks Brothers shirt wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and begging. This was the man she had loved, the man she had given up her empire for, hoping to find a simple, equal partnership. But there had never been equality. There had only ever been his ego and her silence. "I'm going to the hotel, Richard," Maya said, her voice finally trembling, a sliver of genuine heartbreak breaking through her icy exterior. "I need to sign these papers. I need space." "Maya, please don't do this," Richard choked out from the floor. tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "I love you." "You loved being better than me," Maya corrected softly. She turned away, walking past the terrified David and Cynthia Brentwood, past the shattered crystal and spilled wine, and out into the blinding glare of the Maybach's headlights. The heavy oak door closed behind her, leaving Richard Sterling sitting in the ruins of his perfectly immaculate, heavily mortgaged life. The morning sun over Lake Michigan offered no warmth to the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons. At 8 a.m. sharp, the room was a hive of high stakes, ruthless efficiency. 5 senior partners from Covington and Burling sat alongside 2 managing directors from Goldman Sachs. The air smelled of expensive espresso and the metallic tang of impending corporate warfare. Maya stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the crawling traffic of the magnificent mile. She was no longer wearing the understated clearance rack dresses Richard had preferred. She wore a tailored, slate-grey, Alexander McQueen suit that draped her frame like modern armor. Her natural hair, usually pulled back into a modest bun to appease Richard's traditional suburban sensibilities, was now worn free and striking. "The proxies are prepared, Maya," Arthur Hayes said, seated at the head of the massive glass conference table. He tapped a Mont Blanc pen against a towering stack of legal documents. "We have the Goldman underwriters on standby. With your 35%, we authorize the Sterling Cooper acquisition by 10 a.m., and the market responds by the closing bell. Let's get this over with." Winston leaned back in his chair, checking his phone. "It's a $12 billion play, Maya. Don't overthink it. Just sign on the tabs. We have a flight back to Atlanta at noon." Maya turned away from the window. She walked slowly toward the table, her heels sinking silently into the plush carpet. She didn't reach for the pen. Instead, she picked up the executive summary of the acquisition, flipped to the 4th page, and casually dropped it back onto the glass. "I'm not signing it," Maya said calmly. The silence in the penthouse was immediate and absolute. The Goldman Sachs directors exchanged alarmed glances. Winston stopped texting. Arthur's hand froze mid-tap. "Excuse me?" Arthur's voice was dangerously low, a rumbling warning that usually sent his executives running for cover. "You heard me, Father," Maya replied, taking a seat directly opposite him. "I am not authorizing the Sterling Cooper merger. I spent the last 3 years playing a suburban housewife. Yes. But did you honestly think I spent all day baking sourdough and arranging throw pillows?" Winston let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Maya, this is not the time for a rebellion. This is a board mandate. You don't know the logistics sector the way we do. I know that Sterling Cooper's European ground fleet is facing a massive union strike in Germany next quarter, which they've conveniently buried in their risk assessment," Maya countered, her voice snapping like a whip. "I also know they are carrying $3.2 billion in underreported pension liabilities for their retiring domestic workforce. If Hayes Global absorbs them now, our stock drops 15% the moment the SEC filings go public. It's a toxic asset disguised as an expansion." The lead partner from Covington and Burling, an older man named Harrison, paled slightly and looked at his notes. "Ms. Hayes, the pension liabilities are projected to be manageable through asset liquidation." "Don't lie to me, Harrison," Maya warned, her eyes locking onto the lawyer with terrifying precision. "I didn't just run a cute little design agency for 3 years. My primary client under NDA was a forensic accounting firm in London. I redesigned their entire data visualization software. In exchange, I ran the Sterling Cooper financials through their proprietary algorithms. The company is bleeding. You are buying a sinking ship just to boost our quarterly market share." Arthur stared at his daughter. The anger that had initially flashed in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something entirely different. Shock, and beneath that shock, a reluctant, begrudging pride. "You froze your trust," Arthur murmured, leaning forward. "You walked away from the family office. You lived on a mid-level manager's meager salary." "I walked away to see if I could survive without your money, Father," Maya said softly but firmly. "And I did. But I never stopped watching the Empire. It's my legacy, too." She pulled a sleek silver flash drive from her pocket and slid it across the glass table toward the Goldman Sachs directors. "That is a target acquisition profile for Nexus Freight. They are smaller, leaner, have zero pension debt, and possess the exact automated warehousing tech we need to scale. We buy them for $4 billion, save $8 billion, and integrate their tech into our existing fleet." Winston stared at her, his jaw visibly tight. "You can't just upend a year of negotiations in 5 minutes, Maya." "I hold 35% of the voting shares, Winston. My trust vested at midnight," Maya reminded him, a cold smile touching her lips. "I just did." While Maya was conquering the boardroom, Richard Sterling was walking into his own execution. He arrived at the Ardent Solutions corporate park at 7:30 a.m., deeply sleep-deprived and vibrating with panic. He had spent the entire night pacing his empty house, staring at the stain on his dining room rug, trying to process the impossible mathematics of his life. His wife was a billionaire, and he had treated her like an indentured servant. He hoped he could corner David Brentwood, apologize, and somehow leverage Maya's connection to save the logistics contract. He adjusted his tie, plastered on a desperate, confident smile, and walked toward the elevators. His keycard beeped red. Access denied. He tried again. Red. "Mr. Sterling?" Richard turned. 2 building security guards were standing behind him, flanked by a stern-faced woman from HR. "There's a glitch with my card, Brenda," Richard said, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. "There's no glitch, Richard," Brenda said flatly. She handed him a thick manila envelope. "Your employment at Ardent Solutions has been terminated, effective immediately, pending a full internal investigation for gross negligence and conflict of interest." "Terminated?" Richard yelled, his voice echoing in the glass lobby. Other employees stopped and stared. "You can't do this. David and I are friends. I'm up for the VP spot." "David Brentwood was in the office at 4 a.m., drafting your termination papers himself," Brenda replied, her expression completely devoid of sympathy. "You concealed a massive conflict of interest regarding Hayes Global Logistics, and your actions directly sabotaged a $200 million account. You're lucky the company isn't suing you for damages. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items. You have 10 minutes. Richard felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. The VP job. The salary. It was all gone in an instant. As he was marched through the open plan office under the watchful eyes of the guards, he realized the terrifying truth. Without his job, he couldn't pay the mortgage on his massive house. He couldn't pay the minimums on the $45,000 in credit card debt he had accumulated trying to look rich. He was entirely, completely ruined. There was only one way out. He needed his wife. By 2 p.m., Richard was standing in the opulent marble lobby of the Four Seasons. He looked entirely out of place. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was sweating profusely. He marched up to the concierge, demanding the room number for Maya Hayes. Before the concierge could even consult his screen, a massive hand clamped onto Richard's shoulder. It was one of the security men from the night before. "Sir, you need to leave the premises," the guard said, his grip like a steel vice. "Take your hands off me. I'm here to see my wife," Richard shouted, thrashing in the man's grip, drawing stares from wealthy tourists and business executives passing through the lobby. "Maya! Maya! Let him go, Marcus. The voice cut through the lobby like a blade. Richard spun around. Maya was descending the grand staircase. She looked like a goddess of vengeance. The slate-grey suit, the flawless posture, the aura of untouchable wealth. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Behind her walked Winston, and a man Richard recognized as a high-powered Chicago divorce attorney. The guard released Richard, stepping back but keeping his eyes locked on him. "Maya!" Richard gasped, rushing forward, though he stopped a few feet away, intimidated by her sheer presence. "Maya, please, we need to talk. You have to listen to me." Maya stood on the final step, looking down at him. "You have exactly 2 minutes, Richard. Then my flight leaves for Atlanta." "They fired me," Richard blurted out, the humiliation burning his throat. "David fired me this morning. Maya, I'm ruined. The mortgage, the car payments. I can't afford any of it. Please, honey, I know I was stressed last night. I was out of line. But we are husband and wife. We vowed to support each other." Winston let out a scoff, shaking his head in disgust. "The audacity is actually impressive." Maya held up a hand, silencing her brother. She stepped down onto the lobby floor, closing the distance between herself and Richard. For a brief second, Richard saw a flicker of the gentle woman he had married, and a spark of hope ignited in his chest. "You're right, Richard," Maya said softly, her brown eyes searching his face. "We took vows. But let's be honest about why you married me. You didn't marry me because you saw a partner. You married me because you saw someone you could control. Someone who made you feel like a king because you thought I was a peasant." "No, that's not true. I loved you," Richard pleaded, tears springing to his eyes. "You loved the idea of me," Maya corrected, her voice hardening, the softness vanishing entirely. "You loved coming home from your corporate job and explaining the world to me. You loved withholding money from me, so I had to ask for an allowance. You loved putting down my career so yours would look bigger. You built your entire self-esteem on the foundation of my supposed inferiority." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but he had no defense. The truth was stark and undeniable. Maya signaled the attorney behind her. The man stepped forward, handing Maya a sleek leather folder. She opened it and pulled out a thick stack of documents, pressing them firmly into Richard's trembling hands. "What is this?" Richard whispered, looking down at the legal seals. "Divorce papers," Maya said. "Filed this morning. But you don't need to worry about a lengthy legal battle, Richard. It's going to be a very clean break." Richard's eyes darted over the first page, panic setting in. "Maya, wait. You're worth billions. I gave you 3 years of my life. I provided for you. Legally, I'm entitled to—" "You're entitled to absolutely nothing," Maya interrupted, a chilling smile curving her lips. Richard froze. "What? Do you remember the night before our wedding?" Maya asked, her tone conversational but lethal. "You were so worried about your precious $150,000 in your 401k. You were so terrified that your poor, freelance designer wife was going to trap you and take half your middle-class net worth. So you made me sign a prenuptial agreement." Richard felt the blood drain from his head. He remembered. He had bought a cheap, boilerplate prenup online and bullied her into signing it in their kitchen, telling her it was just a formality. "I had my family's lawyers review that little online document last night," Maya continued, leaning in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper, meant only for him. "It states, explicitly, that in the event of a divorce, whatever assets are brought into the marriage by an individual or acquired in their name during the marriage remain solely theirs. No alimony, no spousal support, No division of separate accounts. Richard started to hyperventilate. The document trembled in his hands. "You wrote the contract to protect yourself from my poverty, Richard," Maya said, stepping back, adjusting the cuff of her McQueen jacket. "And in doing so, you legally locked yourself out of my empire. You keep your heavily mortgaged house. You keep your massive credit card debt. You keep your empty 401k, and I keep Hayes Global." "Maya, you can't do this! I'll be homeless!" Richard screamed, his composure completely breaking. People in the lobby were openly staring now, whispering. "You'll figure it out," Maya said, her face an unreadable mask of calm. "After all, you're a very capable provider, or so you've been telling me for 3 years." She turned her back on him. "Maya, please." Richard fell to his knees on the cold marble floor, his hands clutching the divorce papers like a lifeline. He was crying openly, a broken, shattered man who had just watched a winning lottery ticket burn to ashes in his hands. Maya didn't look back. She walked out the revolving glass doors of the Four Seasons, flanked by Winston and the security detail. Outside, a convoy of black SUVs was waiting, engines purring, ready to take the heiress to her private jet, leaving the illusion of her suburban life entirely in the rearview mirror. 6 months later, the oppressive, humid heat of an Atlanta summer baked the city pavement. But inside the executive penthouse of the Hayes Global Tower, the climate was strictly controlled and comfortably cool. Maya Hayes sat at the head of a massive slab of reclaimed Georgia oak that served as her desk. She was no longer just the heiress. She was the newly appointed Chief Strategy Officer of Hayes Global Logistics. The Nexus freight acquisition she had championed in that Chicago hotel room had closed 3 months prior, instantly adding $6 billion in value to the company's portfolio and cementing her reputation on Wall Street as a visionary, ruthless operator. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the glass of her iPad, reviewing the latest quarterly projections when the intercom on her desk buzzed. "Ms. Hayes," her executive assistant's voice chimed. "Harrison from Covington and Burling is here. He says the deposition is ready to begin in conference room B." Maya didn't smile. She just sighed, a sound of mild irritation, like a queen swatting away a particularly persistent mosquito. "Thank you. Tell him I'll be right there." 2,000 miles away from the life she used to know, Maya was about to tie up the final, pathetic loose end of Richard Sterling. Richard's downfall over the past 6 months had been as rapid as it was absolute. Without his corporate salary, the adjustable-rate mortgage on the Oak Brook house had swallowed him whole. Foreclosure proceedings had begun within 90 days. His $45,000 in credit card debt had ballooned with late fees, forcing him to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Worse still, David Brentwood had made sure Richard was blacklisted across the entire Midwest tech infrastructure sector. Desperate, drowning, and entirely stripped of his ego, Richard had found a bottom-feeding contingency lawyer in Chicago who convinced him they could sue Maya for fraudulent inducement. The lawsuit claimed Maya had willfully hidden her identity and wealth, rendering the prenuptial agreement invalid under the pretense of emotional and financial deception. It was a laughable stretch, but Richard needed a miracle. He had flown to Atlanta on a budget airline, his suit noticeably worn and ill-fitting, hoping to corner Maya into a quiet, multi-million-dollar settlement just to make him go away. When Maya walked into conference room B, she didn't look at Richard. She took her seat next to Harrison, her lead counsel, and placed a single, slim manila folder on the table. Richard sat across from her, flanked by his sweaty, cheap-suited attorney. Richard looked terrible. The pale blue eyes that used to scan their suburban kitchen for imperfections were now sunken and hollow. He looked 10 years older. He looked broken. "Ms. Hayes," Richard's attorney began, aggressively puffing out his chest, "we are here today because your client engaged in a systematic, multi-year campaign of deception. My client, Mr. Sterling, entered into a marriage and signed a prenuptial agreement under completely false pretenses regarding your financial standing. We are prepared to take this to trial and expose the Hayes family's manipulative tactics unless a settlement of $20 million is reached." Maya stared at the man with blank, terrifying indifference. She slowly turned her head to look at Richard. "$20 million," Maya repeated softly. "Is that what your pride is worth now, Richard? I thought you were the sole provider, the man who carried the heavy burdens." Richard swallowed hard, his hands trembling under the table. "Maya, please. You lied to me every day for 3 years. You watched me stress over bills. You watched me beg David for that promotion. You owe me this. You owe me for the trauma." "I owe you nothing," Maya stated, her voice dropping to a glacial chill. She opened the manila folder. "Harrison, read Exhibit A into the record." Harrison adjusted his glasses and pulled a sheet of paper from the file. "Email correspondence, dated October 14th, 3 years prior, approximately 2 months before the wedding, from Maya Hayes to Richard Sterling. Subject line, my family's business / total transparency." Richard's face went completely white. "In this email," Harrison continued, his voice echoing in the silent room, "Ms. Hayes explicitly outlines that her father is Arthur Hayes of Hayes Global Logistics. She attached a link to a Forbes article detailing the family's net worth and explained her trust fund structure. She explicitly asked Mr. Sterling to review it before they finalized the prenuptial agreement." Maya leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto Richard like a predator. "Do you remember what you replied, Richard? Or should Harrison read that, too?" Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He felt the room spinning. "Let me," Maya said, taking the paper from Harrison. She looked directly at her ex-husband. "You replied, exactly 22 minutes later, quote, 'Babe, I don't care about your dad's little southern trucking company. I told you, I'm the man of this house. Don't worry your pretty head about business stuff. Leave the finances to me. Just sign the prenup so we can protect my 401k. Richard's attorney slowly closed his legal pad. The case was dead. It wasn't just dead. It was buried under a mountain of documented, arrogant misogyny. "You didn't read it," Maya said, her voice dropping the legal formality, leaving only a heavy, profound pity. "You were so incredibly dismissive of me, so convinced of your own superiority, that you didn't even bother to read a single paragraph about my life. You blinded yourself, Richard. I didn't hide anything. You just refused to see me." Richard sat paralyzed, the oxygen completely sucked from his lungs. The reality of his own hubris was a physical weight, crushing him into the expensive leather chair. He had literally been handed the keys to $1 billion empire, and he had thrown them in the trash because he was too arrogant to look at the keychain. "The lawsuit is frivolous," Harrison stated coldly, packing up his briefcase. "If you do not withdraw this filing by 5 p.m. today, Covington and Burling will countersue Mr. Sterling for malicious prosecution and seek full compensation for our legal fees. Given your client's current bankruptcy status, I imagine that would result in wage garnishment for the rest of his natural life." Maya stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her custom Dior suit, looking down at the man who had once tried to make her feel small. "Goodbye, Richard," she said softly. She turned and walked out of the conference room, the heavy glass doors closing silently behind her. She didn't look back as she walked down the sunlit corridor of her empire. She had a board meeting in 10 minutes. She had a multi-billion-dollar global supply chain to run. And for the first time in her life, Maya Hayes was exactly where she belonged. Ego is a dangerous drug, and blinding arrogance is the quickest path to a complete downfall. Richard Sterling learned the hard way that when you build your entire self-worth on making others feel small, your house of cards will inevitably collapse the moment the truth is revealed. Maya's journey from a silenced, underestimated wife to a formidable billionaire titan proves that true power doesn't need to shout to be heard. It simply waits for the right moment to strike. If you loved this dramatic story of karma, hidden identities, and ultimate poetic justice, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, real-life inspired storytelling. Let us know in the comments below, what would you have done if you were in Maya's shoes? Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and we'll see you in the next story.